What's up guys, Justin here with the CGEssentials.com, back with another Blender geometry nodes tutorial for you. So in today's video, I thought we could kind of get started with geometry nodes, talk about some of the basics, and then go through and create an animation where you can dynamically animate the scale of objects based on the location of something that you have inside of Blender. So that's going to give us a lot of control of the way things are distributed. We'll probably talk about more things like this in the future. But for now, let's go ahead and just jump into it. So first things first, note that this feature is still in development, so we need to download an experimental version of Blender from their website. So you can go to blender.org. Under the downloads function, if you scroll down, there's an option for download Blender experimental, and I'm currently using version 2.93 alpha. So that version is going to have the geometry nodes function in here. If you don't download this, you're not going to have the ability to use the geometry nodes. In addition, do note that these are in beta and alpha, meaning they're not considered stable builds. So it's more something that we're kind of playing around with at this point, so don't use this for production work. So now let's go ahead and jump over into Blender. So I've got version 2.93 in here, and I'm just going to create a new file. So I've got a new file in here. Let's go ahead and delete out that default cube, and I'm going to start by adding a plane. So I'm going to do a Shift A, Mesh, we're going to add a plane, and we're just going to scale it up. We're going to apply our rotation and scale, and then we're going to tab into edit mode and go ahead and right click on this and subdivide it. And let's subdivide this by something that's going to give us a lot of vertices. So we'll go with 50, and we're going to hit the enter key. So now if I tab back into object mode, I have an object in here that's going to make up the surface along which we're going to spread things. So now let's go ahead and let's add another object. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to enable the add-on extra objects, add mesh extra objects that you can find in here. That's going to give me the ability to add a gem. So I'm going to add a gem right here, move it off to the side. I'm going to go ahead and scale that down a bit. And then again, I will apply my rotation and scale. So now we have the objects that we need to start scattering things using geometry nodes. And so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to have the ability to access the nodes editor. And so the first thing we're going to do that is we're going to add a modifier to the plane. So you're going to go to add modifier, and you're going to go for the option for geometry nodes. And so when you add geometry nodes in here, that's going to give you access to those different nodes. And so what I want to do is I want to create a new workspace where I can access that. So I'm just going to click on the plus button right here. I'm just going to add a general layout. And I'm going to move my mouse over this corner and drag down so that I can get a second window. Within that second window, you want to click this drop down and you want to select the option for Geometry Node Editor. So now, this is going to give you access to your geometry nodes. And the first thing you're going to notice is that's going to show up based on whether or not you select the object with the modifier associated with it, right? So this modifier is associated with these nodes right here. And so what we want to do with these nodes is we want to use them in order to place the object on our surface. And so this is going to work the same way that your shader editor is going to work in general. So for example, if I do a Shift A, you can access all of these different nodes. So the first one that we want to access, and so we want to search in here for a point instance node. So if I click on point instance and click in here, that's going to add this to our nodes editor. And what we want to do with this is we want to click on the little eyedropper right here, and we want to give this the value of the gem. And so when you give this the value of the gem, notice what that does is that adds a point or a gem at every vertex of the surface that we've created. So you can use this to easily distribute this object. And then if I was to come in here and adjust the size of this object over here and then apply that rotation and scale, notice how that's going to change over here. So this is basically placing one of these on every single one of the vertices in this shape. But it's really kind of uniform, right? So what we want to do is we want to randomize this up a little bit so that it doesn't have exactly the same thing facing the same direction all over the place. And so the way that we can do that is we can randomize some attributes of this object. And we can do that by doing a Shift A and adding an attribute randomized function. So if I click in here, add an attribute randomize, notice how nothing happened yet. And so the reason for that is because we haven't told this which attribute to randomize. So there's 3, I believe, basic ones that you can type in here. So for example, I could type in a value of scale. Well, if I type in a value of scale, notice how this is going to randomize the scale of each object, right? It's coming in here and it's randomizing this based on the value that I select in here. You could also type in a value of rotation. And so if you type in rotation, that's going to randomize your rotation. Finally, you could also type in a value of position. And so if you type in a value of position, notice that you don't want a value of float in here. What you want instead is you want a value of vector. And so when you select a value of vector, what that's going to do is that is going to allow you to set the X, Y, and Z axes like this. So notice how you can randomize the position of all of these objects in here. So you could put this at like 1, 1, 2 if you wanted to. So it gets a little weirder when you start randomizing position, but this does give you the ability to randomize the position as well. But what we want to do for right now is we want to go back and we want to leave this randomizing our scale. So I'm going to type in a value of scale in here. Notice how this is getting a little bit weird because we've got this currently set as the vector. We want to take that and put it back to our float. So that's going to give us a nice a uniform randomization. So now let's add another attribute randomize. So to do that, we're going to do a Shift A. And in this case, we're going to add another randomize right here. And in this case, we want to randomize a rotation like this. So you could either leave our rotation as a float, or you could also adjust the vector in here. So you can see how by adjusting the vector, you can set how this rotates on an axis. So this can give you a little bit more control if you decide to do that. It's not really that big of a deal one way or the other, but this is a good way to set that randomization. And so before I go any further, I want to throw in a plug for a great channel that I've been learning a lot from called Sketches for Humanity. So you should go check out this channel and subscribe. He's got some really great stuff in here, but in particular, he's got 2 really great videos in here about procedural motion graphics and a procedural force field effect that are both really great for learning how to use geometry nodes. So go check out his channel and go subscribe. Watch those 2 videos. Those are going to give you a lot of information. He gets a lot more in-depth than I do in this video. All right, so now, and I want to keep this pretty simple. I don't want to get too over the top with it for right now, but what I want to do is, we've seen a lot of videos so far where things get kind of placed or scaled up based on the location of another object inside of Blender. So for example, let's add an empty. So let's add, under empty, we're just going to select the sphere right here. I'm just going to move this over to this point. And so what I want to do is I want to set this up where the scale of the objects change based on the proximity or the closeness of this object to our geometry. And so we can do that by combining geometry nodes with vertex groups. And so what I want to do is I want to start by clicking into this object right here, and I want to add a new modifier because we need another variable that we can use up here that links it to the location of our empty. And so what I want to do that is I want to click on this add modifier. There's an option in here for vertex weight proximity, right? So if I click on that, what that's going to do is that's going to weight the vertices of our object based on the location of another object. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to create a vertex group for this object so that we can see exactly what's being affected. So the way that we can do that is we can select our plane right here. We're just going to tab into edit mode. So when we tab into edit mode, notice how the plane is in here. So if I was to turn my geometry nodes off, we can just see our plane right here. Well, we just want to tap the A key to select them all. We want to go over into our vertex groups. we just want to add a vertex group with all of our vertices in here. So I'm going to click the plus button right here, and we can go ahead and we can name this. We'll call it proximity. That's what I've seen other people call it, and it kind of makes sense. So we'll call that proximity. Note that if this is capital or not is going to be important, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to assign this. So now if we were to click off of this and then click on the select, that would show us that all of these are selected. So now we can go back into this modifier group, and the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we're doing the weighting before our geometry nodes, not after. So we're going to move this up right here. We're basically going to tell this to use our proximity vertex group, and our target object is going to be our empty. So basically what that's going to do is that's going to weight the vertices in here based on the location of our empty. And so if we were to jump over into weight paint mode right here, so notice how right now you're not really getting a very good effect, right? So we could bring this up, but notice how this is only going to weight like the whole thing or nothing at all. So what we want to do is we want to switch this to geometry. So when we switch this to geometry, then move this up, and we may do more tutorials on something like this in the future. And so notice how now this is weighting our vertices based on the location of this empty. So for example, and let's go back into object mode for just a second. Let's see where to keyframe this object. So I'm going to right click, insert keyframe, whoops, and we're going to call it location. And then at 100, we'll have this be keyframed over here. So I'm going to right click, insert keyframe, location. So now if I go back into weight paint mode, right here, and I move this, notice how the weighting is set based on the location of our empty. So what that's doing is that's basically weighting the vertices in here. Well, now we can link back to this inside of our geometry nodes in order to use that location of the object to affect everything. So, because what we've got is we've got a variable called proximity now. So what we're going to do is we're going to click back into our geometry nodes, and we're going to add an attribute mix node. So we're going to do a search, an attribute mix right here. Well, notice how that attribute mix basically allows us to take these objects and we can mix them, we can add them together, we can do a lot of different things in here. Well, in this case, what we want to do is we want to do a multiply. So let's go ahead and turn our geometry nodes back on. So we're going to look at this right here. All right, so we're going to keep this really simple when we add this attribute mix node. And so we're going to set this to be a multiply. And we're going to set our factor to be an attribute, our A to be an attribute, and our B to be a float. And so what we want to do is the factor is the thing we want to multiply by. And in this case, that factor is going to be our value of proximity. Remember, if you typed in a capital P here, it needs to be a capital P over here. And so for the A, we're just going to type in a value of scale. And our result is also going to be a value of scale. And I'm going to leave B at 0 because what B does is B allows us to basically only have these show up around our object. So now if I move around my object like this, notice how these are scaling up based on the location of our object. So if I was to set this to something higher, right, then all of these other objects would be in here. And there's actually some interesting things you could do with that as well, but let's leave it at 0 for a second. And so the only thing I want to do is I want to set the scale to be higher or bigger when this moves around, right? I want this effect to be more pronounced. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to do a Shift A. We're just going to add an attribute math in here like this. And all I want to do is I want to take this value. So it's going to be my scale. And I'm just going to multiply it by 2. So I'm just going to type in, or actually this is going to be a float value of 2. And then our result is going to be our scale. So notice how what that did is that means that the scale value is double what it was with the proximity of our object. So you can see how you can use this in order to make these grow or shrink based on the location of your empty. So one other thing about this, and then we'll call it quits for right now, is you can adjust how wide this effect goes by going into your vertex weight proximity modifier and adjusting that. So Notice how that's a wider effect based on that location. So I've now got this set up where wherever this object goes, our gems are going to get bigger. So there's other things we could do in here as well, which I don't want to mess around with too much. But that should give you kind of a general idea of how you can get started with with geometry nodes inside of Blender. Alright, so that's where I'm going to end this video. Obviously, there's a lot to learn when it comes to geometry nodes. It's almost more like programming to me than adding the modifiers was before. So it's just a different interface to get used to. But we'll talk more about geometry nodes in the future. But leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought. If you've tried these out before, I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you like this video, please remember to click that like button down below. If you're new around here, remember to click that subscribe button for new Blender content every week. If you like what I'm doing in this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Every little bit helps, so make sure to check out that link in the notes down below. But in any case, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.